Hello everybody, we're ready to get started with the endocrine system anatomy here, Biology 202, Unit 1. So here's what you need with you. Unit 1 Anatomy Study Guide. If you have not printed this out from Blackboard, you need this, and if you look on here, it's pretty clearly showing you things that are highlighted in bold. Those are the anatomical structures, features of the endocrine system that you will have to be able to identify when you take the Unit 1 anatomy exam. So, not very many things. Don't get used to it. This is probably the lightest unit in terms of anatomy. Now, because there's not a lot of anatomy that you have to know for the endocrine system, what I am going to ask you on the anatomy exam, in addition to these identification questions, I want you to know the hormones that each endocrine gland produces, the ones that we've covered over on the physiology lecture side, and then the disorders that I have discussed on the physiology videos. And no, I'm not going to go through that information with you here over on the anatomy side. You will need to fill that type of information in for yourself, and that'll help you start learning the hormones that are made by each gland and the disorders that we've discussed. So those types of questions will be multiple choice or multiple answer. Like I might show you a picture of the pituitary gland and give you a list of hormones, and I'm going to ask you check off all of the hormones that are made by this gland. So you'll have to know, hey, that's the anterior pituitary gland, and these are the hormones that are made by the anterior pituitary. Or I might show you a picture of the thyroid gland, and you'll have to know, well, that's the thyroid gland, and here check off the hormones that are made by the thyroid gland. Disorders, things like Graves' disease, pituitary dwarfism, things like that. There are several different disorders, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, diabetes insipidus. Several different disorders are discussed over on the physiology side, so be sure you are keeping track of which gland those disorders are associated with, because I'm going to ask you those types of questions on the anatomy test. That won't be typical for the course. I mean, that's something that's going to be kind of unique to the endocrine system, since there's so much physiology content for endocrine and not a whole lot of anatomy. Okay, so let's get started. Endocrine system anatomy. All right, first of all, you need to be able to identify the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland of the body because it produces so many different endocrine hormones. Those hormones and their functions are discussed over on the physiology side of the unit. And the hypothalamus, which you of course learned about in Biology 201, a very important part of the brain that plays many different roles in homeostasis and also even in things like controlling our emotions. And the hypothalamus is sometimes called the master of the master because the hypothalamus actually produces a number of hormones. It secretes hormones that travel this little short distance down here to the anterior section of the pituitary and stimulate the production of other hormones from the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is actually controlling what the anterior pituitary produces. All right, so I'm going to flip over to Visible Body, which is a 3D anatomy app. And again, on Blackboard, I've got links to various 3D anatomy apps that you might want to check out. And some of those are free and some of those are not. Visible Body is probably the best one. I like it a lot. It's not free though. If you want to purchase it, it'll probably cost you about 40 bucks. All right, so let's take a look at the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. All right, so hopefully you're recognizing that this is the brain, and the brain is cut open. So it's cut in half. We have a sagittal section here through the brain. And so where is the hypothalamus and the pituitary? Now hopefully you've learned these before. Here's your pituitary gland right there. Let me bring up my pen here. All right, let's zoom in. Turn off my pen here for a second. Zoom in really closely. See, these are nice because you can rotate things around. And there's your pituitary gland. And up in here, where is your hypothalamus? Your hypothalamus is actually this area right up in here. That's the hypothalamus. And hopefully you recognize that from Biology 201. The hypothalamus is actually composed of neurons that form parts of the walls of the third ventricle, that little thin fluid-filled space that you have right in here in this area. You have a fluid-filled space in here that's called the third ventricle. This portion down in here, the neurons that actually compose the walls of that fluid-filled space make up what's known as the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus has clusters of neuron cell bodies that have different functions and different jobs. And so you'll hear more about that over on the physiology side of the class. All right, another thing you should know, there is a stalk right in here that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and that stalk is called the infundibulum. And that's another term that you may have learned over in Biology 201 as well. All right, let me go back over to the PowerPoint. All right, now zooming in a little bit more closely here. The pituitary gland is divided up into an anterior portion and a posterior portion. So this is actually a diagram from your textbook. And so you can see here they're showing you a brain with a mid-sagittal section through the brain. This is the anterior portion of the brain. Here's the posterior portion. And now we're zooming in on the hypothalamus right in here. And here's the stalk in between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. That's your infundibulum. So you need to know how to identify that. And then here's your pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is divided up into two major lobes. You have the anterior lobe, which is a little bit bigger, and then you've got your posterior lobe back in here. So that's not too difficult to know. The anterior lobe is sometimes called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is sometimes called the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis cerebri is another name for the pituitary gland. And the anterior portion can also be called the adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to, when you hear that prefix, it refers to secretion, some sort of secretory structure in the body, produces substances and releases those to the outside. The posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis, neuro referring to nervous tissue, because this portion of the pituitary is actually composed of nervous tissues. Most of it actually consists of bundled axons that are extending from downward from up here in the hypothalamus, and that's going to be covered in more detail over on the physiology side of the course. The anterior pituitary consists of glandular epithelial tissue. You got a whole bunch of cells in here that make a number of different hormones that you see listed over here. Those are going to be covered on the physiology side. All right, how about the pineal gland? And now this, hopefully you learned in Biology 201 as well. So you got your pituitary gland over here on the anterior side, anterior inferior portion of the brain. Pineal gland is back over here on the posterior inferior portion of the brain, more or less on the posterior side of the diencephalon. If you guys remember, this section of the brain up in here is called the diencephalon, and the pineal gland is over there on the posterior side. So let's bring this up in visible body. Rotate this around. Let me change views. Here we go. Here's another view in the brain here on visible body. Now here what they've done, they've left the diencephalon in place. So here's your diencephalon, here's your brainstem. Down in here, we can zoom out a little bit further. Here's your cerebellum, and here's half of the cerebral part of the brain, the cerebrum over here. All right, so they've left that diencephalon in place. And if we rotate around, right there and right there. Let me multi-select those so we can light those up together. That little spot there, that's your pineal gland. So it's back here on the posterior portion of the diencephalon. This little two-headed structure that you have in the internal portion of the brain that sits up on top of the brainstem. So that's your, let me zoom out. So pineal gland is right there. Over here on the anterior side, there's your pituitary gland. So they're on opposite sides. All right, pineal gland function, we'll talk about that over on the physiology side. Most important hormone it makes is melatonin, which is important for your sleep-wake cycles. Just kind of interesting. All right, next one. Let's move on to the thyroid gland. All right, your thyroid gland, as you guys learned about in Biology 201, is a butterfly-shaped gland, and it is anterior to the trachea. So this blue ring tube you see there represents the trachea. So the thyroid gland is not hard to identify, but I do want you guys to know some of the internal parts as well. So if you zoomed in at a microscopic level into thyroid tissue, this is what you would see if you were actually looking at a stained two-dimensional slice through the thyroid under the microscope. And over here you have a diagram which is representing what tissues look like inside the thyroid. So the thyroid is actually made up of a bunch of spherical shaped structures on the inside. Those are called follicles. And if you imagine each of those follicles as being like a hollow ball, like a basketball, the surface of the ball is composed of follicular cells. And that's what they're showing you over here. Like here's a thyroid follicle, here's a thyroid follicle over here, and they're kind of exaggerating the size, but these purple cells that you see right here, those are the follicular cells. So they make up the surface of the thyroid follicles. Now over here on this tissue diagram, in the light pink, that's the inside of the follicles. These follicular cells exist here at the surface. So you're looking at a 2D slice through a bunch of these follicles. So if you imagine making a two-dimensional slice through like a cluster of grapes, you know, what would you see? You know, if you could make a 2D slice through something like that, look like a bunch of circles and ovals after you cut through them. So now on this tissue diagram over here, wherever you see the little purple spots, the dark purple spots, those are the nuclei of cells that are located there on that tissue slice. The lighter pink, or the hotter pink kind of colors on there represent cytoplasm and also some filler spaces, some of the filler tissues in between the connective tissues that exist between the follicles. Okay, what about these light pink areas in here? Those represents the substance on the inside of the follicles, and that's called colloid that exists inside there. That's a jelly-like substance, and you can see that labeled over here as well. All right, so you should know what colloid is. We'll talk more about the function of colloid over on the physiology side, but that's a jelly-like substance where you have immature thyroid hormones are stored in there so they can be released into the bloodstream on an as-needed basis. All right, let me erase all of that. All right, now in between, let me change my pen color here. I'm going to get this to show up a little bit better. All right, so you have in between, I don't know if it's going to show up all that well. There we go. In between the follicles, you have connective tissues in there. Connective tissues fill up spaces between other types of structures in the body. So in between those follicles, you have connective tissue surrounding those follicles, and you do have some cells in here that are represented there on the diagram, and then also kind of like where I drew in those lighter blue spots. Those are the parafollicular cells. Para means next to, and those parafollicular cells are also hormone producing cells. Over on the physiology side, we'll talk about how your follicular cells make T3 and T4. Those are your main thyroid hormones. And these parafollicular cells make calcitonin, which is a hormone that actually doesn't have normal functions in human beings. It does have functions in calcium homeostasis in other types of mammals. But we'll talk more about that over on the physiology side. So do know the difference between the follicular cells and the parafollicular cells. Know what the follicles are, and know what colloid is. That's that jelly-like substance that fills up the inside of those follicles. All right, next one. How about our parathyroid glands? All right, parathyroid glands. So if you take your thyroid gland and you look at a posterior view, that's what you're seeing here on this diagram. So we're looking at it from a posterior view. So this is actually the pharynx and leading down to the esophagus here, which is behind or posterior to the trachea. And of course the thyroid wraps all the way around the front side of the trachea, but the sides of it actually wrap all the way back around toward the esophagus. And on the posterior side of the thyroid, you have, most people have anywhere between 4 and 8 of these little tiny glands called parathyroid glands. And let me show you those on visible body. You can bring up our parathyroid gland. All right, let's rotate this guy around and kind of zoom out a little bit. There's the thyroid gland sitting on the anterior side of the trachea. And if we wrap this around on the back side and zoom in, let's deselect. There's your esophagus. And then these structures are the cartilage rings of the trachea. And then each of those that I'm lighting up is a parathyroid gland. So really tiny, sitting there on the posterior side of the thyroid. Those are pretty easy to keep track of. Remember, para means next to. So these are next to the thyroid gland. So even though they're next to the thyroid gland, they make a completely different hormone from the thyroid gland. These different glands make different hormones that aren't really even related to each other in terms of their functions. All right, I'm actually going to stop this particular video clip here, and then I will pick up with the rest of the endocrine anatomy on the next video clip. I'll chop it up so it's not all jumbled together on one long video.